Dear guests, kindly switch off your mobile phones or set them to silent mode. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of His Excellency Professor Jamal Sanad al-Suwaidi, Director General of the Emirates Center for Strategic Studies and Research, we would like to welcome you this evening to a lecture titled Key Global and Regional Challenges, A View from Germany, to be delivered by His Excellency Ambassador Peter Fischer. Ambassador Peter Fischer's previous position was Director for Energy and Climate Policy and Export Control at the German Federal Foreign Office. His portfolio covers global energy and climate policy, as well as export control and international sanctions. Ambassador Fischer, a career diplomat, joined the Federal Foreign Office in 1986. He has focused on economic and global issues. He was head of the Environmental Department and chief economist at the Federal Foreign Office in Berlin. He worked as foreign policy advisor at the Office of the Federal President, and he was head of the Economic Department at German missions in Washington, London, Shanghai, and Singapore. And now, we would like to welcome His Excellency to deliver his lecture. Please.
Thank you very much. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'll just open some water in case I need a sip during my talk. There we go. Well, thank you again. Thank you for taking the time to attend my talk. And I'm honored and delighted to join you this evening. And from up here, it looks even more impressive than from where you are. I would like to share with you some thoughts on key global and regional challenges, a view from Germany. And I'll start with a quote by Sheikh Zayed. They told me it's always good to start with a quote from Sheikh Zayed. And Sheikh Zayed was a wise man. Among other wise things he said was, "He who does not know his past cannot make the best of his present and future, for it is from the past that we learn." And I quote that because this is, of course, very relevant to Germany, given our history. And our approach to the world and to our foreign policy and to our view of the international order is, of course, based very much on our history. So in my talk, what I want to do is talk about the concepts and principles that we have learned from our history and how we apply them to foreign policy today. I'll divide my talk into 4 parts. First, I'll describe where Germany comes from and what the basis of our international engagement is. From that, I'll come on to some general principles of our foreign policy and set out how we see the so-called cross-cutting issues. Another term for cross-cutting issues can be global issues. In other words, challenges that the whole world is facing. For example, climate change, food, or water security. What are these challenges, and what is our idea of how best to deal with them? In this section, I'll talk about something fundamental, and you'll hear this more than once in my talk. Namely, our support for what we call a rules-based international order with multilateral cooperation. I will also talk about sustainability. And let me say straight off what the thesis of that chapter will be. If we don't rise to the global challenges, we will live in a world with much higher risk of instability and conflict. These global issues that I mentioned are the basis for everything else. Another way to say this is everything we do is worth nothing if we don't do it in a sustainable manner. Then in a third part, I'll share with you our outlook on the major trends as we head into 2019. And here again, I'd like to give you a preview of our assessment. it's not great. There are several developments which give reason for serious concern. In a final part of my talk, I'll look at some of the regional issues of this region through the lens of the principles which I've set out. My conclusions will be about why I think the UAE and Germany, as well as the European Union, have much to offer to each other, to their regions, and yes, to the world. I believe we should make every effort to deepen our partnership, to work together to make the world a better place. So let's start by looking at Germany. What is this place, Germany, all about, and why do the Germans behave like they do? I was going to do a quick survey of the audience, maybe just by a show of hands. How many people know when the Federal Republic of Germany was founded? Nobody knows? Some of the Europeans should know. Well, okay. It was 1949. How many know how many neighbors Germany has? Any guess? Anyone? 5, 10, 20? Yeah, it's 9. We have more neighbors than almost any other country in the world. Austria, Switzerland, France, Luxembourg, Belgium, Netherlands, Denmark, Poland, and Czechia. So we really are in the middle of Europe, surrounded by 9 neighbors, and if I may say so, friends. How many people know how many times Germany has been world champion in football? Come on, here I need to see a few more hands. 4 times. We're one of the best, and we're coming back. So, to get back to the serious part of my talk, to understand the basic setup of our country, I think it's always a good idea to look at our Constitution. It actually spells out very significant principles which determine our position in the world. The German Constitution is from 8th of May, 1949. Now, I don't want to give a lecture about history, but maybe I can offer you some background of where Germany stood in 1949 and how we got there. So Germany became a unified national state quite late. Not as late as UAE, but late for a European country, namely in 1871. And between 1871 and the time we signed our modern constitution, which was in 1949, we had an extremely turbulent history. First, we became an empire, then we were defeated in World War I, then our monarchy was abolished, we became a republic, then there was economic depression. Our country in the 1920s and 1930s was close to civil war, and there was violence in the streets. Then totalitarianism rose in our country in the form of the Nazis. Then we became guilty of unspeakable crimes in World War II and the genocide of the Holocaust. So that kind of sets the scene for our founding fathers who gathered in 1949 to write a constitution. At that time, our country and everything it stood for had, to use an American phrase, hit the wall. Sometimes it is called the 0 hour for Germany. The rubble of World War II was still smoldering. Tens of millions of people were dead and maimed. We were excluded from the circle of civilized nations. The country had lost its sovereignty and was under military occupation. In this situation, our founding fathers came up with a remarkable document, and I'd like to just quote a few passages so I understand what the foundation is of our international action. The first words in our Constitution are the preamble, and the second sentence in that preamble says the following, and I quote, "Inspired by the determination to promote world peace as an equal partner in a united Europe, the German people have adopted this basic law." So here we already have 2 key passages. Peace, world peace is our noblest goal, and the way to achieve it is a united Europe. The European Union, in which Germany should be an equal partner, was a core goal from the very first moment. And let me say this very clearly. It still is today. Please do not get distracted by the headlines about Brexit, populism, Hungary, you name it. The great majority of citizens in Europe know that the EU is and will be the foundation of our prosperity, as well as stability and peace. All those who claim that a retreat from the European Union into some kind of isolation or nationalism, I'm sorry to say, are peddling illusions. And I am personally convinced that this will become clearer over time, and much of the populist phenomena we see today will fade away. But back to our Constitution. After the preamble comes Article 1, Sentence 1, one which I really like. So this is really where our Constitution begins. And again, I quote from the Constitution. It says, "Human dignity shall be inviolable. To respect and to protect it shall be the duty of all state authority." So here the Founding Fathers declare that the German state is meant to be the exact opposite of the Nazi state. Every human being has equal dignity, and the first duty of all state authority is to respect and protect it. Then comes Articles 1 to 19. Those are the basic rights of all Germans. And then we come to Article 20, and that's the last part that I'll quote today. In Article 20, the core part of our Constitution starts, and it says, "The Federal Republic of Germany is a democratic, social, federal state." This is quite significant, and its implications are often not really well known, even by many Germans. Federal Republic of Germany is a democratic and social federal state. What does that mean? Okay, everyone knows that we are a Western-style parliamentary democracy, but a federal social state? We're a federation, just like the UAE, by the way. We're composed of 16 states, and I mentioned that one because it means our internal setup is geared towards joining the European Union. The principle is called subsidiarity, which means we have a federation. Each state has its own parliament, government, its own rights, and the central part, Berlin, should only deal with those issues that aren't better settled at the state level. And that's the same way that the European Union should function, that the European Union should only deal with those issues that aren't better settled by the individual member states. So the point is, from the beginning, we were set up to join the European Union. But I'd like to emphasize even more the part about being a social state. Have any of you ever heard that the German Constitution prescribes that Germany is a social state? Probably not. What does it mean? It means that our Constitution prescribes a certain vision of the economy and society. This vision is a German invention, and we call it the social market economy. It means that in economic policy, we want to go a middle road between the free market and government intervention. We want to combine the power and efficiency of the market on the one hand with social balance on the other hand. Yes, we have a free market, but we understand that some people fail in the market. And we are skeptical when someone tells us that markets are always rational and will regulate themselves. So that's where, according to the German Constitution, the government is to step in and to prevent unjust market outcomes and to help those that struggle. So while we're the fourth largest economy in the world and one of the most open and competitive, we also have a constitutional duty to protect and empower those in our society who are vulnerable. And this vision translates to our view of the world. So there we were in 1949, determined to be the opposite of the Nazis, to serve the peace of the world, build a united Europe as a basis for peace, and to strive for social justice at home and in the world. What happened then? We invested fully into being part of the West and the post-war international order that was created under the leadership of the USA. Let's just mention the United Nations, the IMF, and the World Bank as examples. In Germany, we like to call it, and I come back to what I mentioned initially, rules-based multilateral cooperation. The underlying notion is that the world community would be subject to universally applicable and to some extent enforceable standards underpinned by legal and institutional structures. We shared sovereignty in the EU. NATO is the basis of our collective security. We promoted this model at a regional and global level, and it has served us well. Germany was led back into the circle of civilized nations. We built reconciliation and friendship with our former enemies. Let me just mention the friendship with France as a particular case in point. And by the way, just yesterday, France and Germany signed a new treaty called the Treaty of Aachen, recommitting to even deeper cooperation and integration in the framework of the European Union. And let me also mention, even though I realize it might not be popular with some of you, our friendship with Israel. It shows that even after the worst you can imagine, there can be progress in history. Germany achieved a high degree of stability and prosperity. The West, in quotation marks, won the Cold War. We did it through a combination of being tough and resilient in the face of aggression and threats, but at the same time always reaching out our hand to our foes in the East, the Soviet Union and its allies, and offering cooperation and mutual benefit. Germany and Europe overcame their divisions. Germany continued its development as a stable hub of global connectivity and deep integration into the world economy. And not only Germany benefited from the post-World War II liberal world order. The world as a whole experienced an unprecedented era of economic and social progress. And although, of course, it was not always peaceful, compared to previous epochs, there was progress in limiting conflict and violence. Our conclusion was and continues to be, especially in the current age of globalization, the rules-based multilateral cooperation, well-regulated and transparent markets, and partnerships based on confidence and trust are the best guarantee of a good life for everyone. This brings me to the global issues. We can summarize them maybe in the UN Sustainable Development Goals. We believe that global issues require global solutions, and global solutions are best found through multilateral cooperation. It's clear we are consuming the Earth's natural resources faster than they are able to regenerate. Once you understand that, you can't avoid the conclusion that we're on a dangerous path. And from a diplomat's perspective, it is also clear. How can we imagine a stable and peaceful world if we don't manage to provide the quickly growing world population with a safe climate, with food, water, and energy? We cannot imagine a stable world under those conditions. And no country can solve these issues alone. They require global collaboration. But at the beginning of 2019, is the world community moving towards collaboration? Unfortunately, not. We are witnessing a return of national sovereignty as an ideology. Competition among the great powers is increasing, notably between the US, China, and Russia, but of course also here in this region. The international order, which had served us well, is fragmenting. It is fragmenting politically. Some countries prefer to go it on their own and claim that multilateral constraints are a disadvantage. It is fragmenting in terms of international security arrangements. Witness the developments around the Medium-Range Nuclear Weapons INF Arms Control Treaty, which is about to fail. It is fragmenting economically with trade friction rising between the major economies, a lack of support for the World Trade Organization, and the international financial architecture is being split up. It may be fragmenting technologically with the emergence of technological haves and have-nots, as well as separate digital spheres of influence and control. And finally, even many societies are showing signs of fragmentation. For example, the so-called big tent political parties that used to help build moderation and consensus in the middle of Western societies are being challenged by emerging movements at the more radical fringes. All this is raising the transaction cost of international relations. The world has gotten more complicated and more difficult to navigate. All this has also raised the risk profile that we are confronted with. I'm quite concerned that many things are being torn down now without anything better being built up in their place. And I'm afraid that we will see the full negative effect of this only in 10 years or so. Germany intends to push back against this. We want to make a fresh investment into a multilateral, rules-based world order. We know this approach is not perfect. It does not provide instant solutions to many of the deep problems and conflicts, but is certainly better than, let's call it, the law of the jungle, where it's everyone on their own to pursue their narrow self-interest. That would be the rule of strength rather than the rule of law, and that does not correspond to our vision and our constitutional goals as I have laid them out for you. We intend to push back together with our partners in the European Union and other like-minded countries, and especially in close coordination with France. We certainly have the platforms for that. Germany has just started its tenure as a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council. We want the UN Security Council to bear the chief responsibility for safeguarding world peace, and it needs to work with other multinational, regional, and also state and non-state actors to take humanitarian, stabilization, developmental, financial, and similar measures. So we will push back in the UN, the G20, the G7, and at all similar occasions. There's one concept in particular that we will push for, and that's addressing the full conflict cycle. Let me explain. We need to get ahead of conflict rather than coming in only when people have started shooting at each other. Our approach is to deal with conflict in a comprehensive manner. Don't just come in like a fire brigade when the house is on fire, because then it may be too late. It is better to do most of the work before a conflict breaks out. We must focus more on preventive foreign policy. We'll look at the global issues, for example. Again, climate, food, water, energy, health, education. If we don't get those right and wait until there is a fire, then we won't have a fire hose big enough to put it out. In other words, and I repeat what I said earlier, if we don't change our course towards living on this planet in a sustainable manner, then we will be facing risks to stability and security for which we have no instruments. By the way, I would contend that parts of our house are already on fire from climate change. See, for example, the extreme weather events, the droughts and floods that are destroying people's livelihoods in many parts of the earth. They are fundamental drivers of competition over ever scarcer resources and drivers of migration, and both can lead to tensions. Throw in some tribal, ethnic, religious, or political dispute, and you have all the ingredients for a potentially violent conflict. The poverty and miscontent in Syria, for example, was preceded by a record-breaking drought. So some scholars are saying that climate change was the spark that brought the Syrian powder keg to explosion. And maybe Syria is a sad case in point that when the fire brigade arrives, when the house is already on fire, we don't really have an effective instrument for putting it out. So what does preventive diplomacy look like? What can it look like? How do we properly address the full conflict cycle? The first is that we need better foresight and early warning systems, looking at all potential drivers of conflict. Then, any measures we take to support a just and sustainable human development are the best prevention we can take. If people see progress, they are likely to engage in making money and improving their lives rather than fighting or killing their neighbor. There are also political preventive measures, like ensuring collaborative community activities, stakeholder dialogues, institution building, and strengthening of institutional relationships. All that happens before a crisis. Of course, if a crisis becomes hot, then efforts need to be deployed against it. They can be military or policing, anti-terrorism, or border management. But these, and this is an evident lesson from all military interventions, including most recently, for example, Afghanistan or Iraq, only go so far. It is never enough to win the war. You have to win the peace. In other words, once the weapons are silenced, you have to engage in post-conflict stabilization and peace building. Germany has been deploying major efforts on stabilization. Stabilization means making sure people see a quick dividend. For example, in Syria and Iraq, where it is important to support an improvement in living conditions in areas that have been liberated from ISIS. Immediate measures address basic needs, removing IEDs and mines, collecting the weapons and demilitarizing, disbanding armed groups and militias, providing water, food, and electricity, opening roads, housing, and schools. And after that, the really hard work begins. Post-conflict stabilization and peace building, mediation between groups in conflict, supporting reconciliation, ensuring fair representation of stakeholders, including women and minorities, reforming the security sector, building up legal structures and institutions, and of course, supporting economic development. Our German work on stabilization actually has one main focus. We call it the arc of crisis. And from our perspective, it goes in our southern neighborhood from northern Africa and the Maghreb through the Near and Middle East to Afghanistan and Pakistan. I'll pick out two examples of what we do. We've been very active in the stabilization of Iraq, where we've spent around 50 million euros in 2018, and also in Syria, where together with the UAE and the US, we have created the Syria Recovery Trust Fund and paid in 39 million euros. So it is with this kind of comprehensive approach to preventing and managing crises that Germany has chosen the following priorities for its tenure on the UN Security Council in 2019 and 2020. Women, peace and security, climate and security, non-proliferation, peace building, prevention, human rights and security, and health and security. That's our comprehensive approach. Now let's have a look at the region from a German perspective. MENA is our neighboring region. What happens here affects us directly. An immediate example are the Syrian refugees that have come to Germany and which we have welcomed in great numbers. And of course, we know that stability around the Gulf and the Straits of Hormuz, as well as along the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb, are of strategic importance to the EU and the world. Unfortunately, MENA is a tough neighborhood. We see international and domestic conflict, rapid population growth, structural and political problems in many countries. Syria, Iran, Middle East peace, Yemen, Iraq are active hotspots that cloud regional prospects with geopolitical risks. The German business community here tells me that most of them are here to serve the Gulf region. And in the background, they were always hoping that Iran would emerge as an attractive market. But now they say the business model Gulf has taken a beating and dark clouds have gathered over Iran. Germany would like to contribute to reducing the geopolitical risk in this region. Let me just pick out a couple of issues. Our investment in crisis prevention and stabilization worldwide reached over 800 million euros in 2017. In Syria, we support the UN Mediation Office efforts and the team with personnel and financially. We also supported the Syrian opposition delegation to the Geneva talks. I mentioned the Syria Recovery Trust Fund, which, for example, provides water for 900,000 people in the Aleppo region. We also support the White Helmets in Syria, who are saving injured and recovering dead people, and we put about 50 million euros into rehabilitating damaged hospitals in Syria. On Iran, probably something that's on all of your minds, let me say the following. We thought the JCPOA was a good deal because it put the Iranian nuclear industry under international supervision and prevented Iran from building a nuclear weapon. Please don't believe that we are only soft on Iran. The EU has over 200 active sanctions in place against Iran for terrorism, their ballistic missile programs, and human rights violations. But our approach is never maximum pressure alone. Yes, we are tough and we apply pressure, but we always combine it with the offer of cooperation and positive incentives in case of changed behavior. Our historic experience is that in dealing with your enemies, don't rely entirely on confrontation. Always look for a channel to communicate and areas in which to practice cooperation. Start with small steps if necessary. From practical cooperation grows trust, and trust opens new doors, even the door of friendship. We don't believe that maximum pressure alone will lead to the desired result. In fact, we are concerned that it could lead to a strengthening of the hardliners in Iran and to a reinforcement of their unacceptable behavior of meddling in other countries, exporting terrorisms, and proliferating weapons of mass destructions. And if Iran decided to cancel the JCPOA and continue its work on building a nuclear bomb, then we would have a hot nuclear crisis in this region, and we think that's an extremely undesirable outcome. Final word on Yemen. Again, we have the same comprehensive approach that I mentioned. We have full support for the efforts of the United Nations Special Envoy. And just last week, we had a conference in Berlin about stabilization efforts, and we were very pleased that the UAE participated at a high level. The main question was, how can we find partners on the ground in Yemen to work with to do this kind of stabilization activity? I'm out of time, but I will end on a positive note. If you give me one more minute, please. The UAE is by far our largest trade and investment partner in this region. We do almost double as much trade with the UAE as we do with Saudi Arabia. Maybe a surprising result. I think our partnership has potential for much more. In many ways, Germany and the UAE share the same vision. A vision of a society based on tolerance and respect and a knowledge-based economy, with big investments into our people, education and training, science, technology and culture, and sustainability. Germany and the UAE are both open economies and hubs of international connectivity. That's why we both support a rules-based international order based on multilateral cooperation. It is my mission and the mission of my colleagues at the German embassy to identify projects where Germany and the UAE together can add value to our shared ideals, and to find projects how we can cooperate as partners and friends. I really think that we can make a significant contribution together for the benefit not only of our own citizens, but also of our regions and the world, and to build a good future on our one and only shared planet. Thank you for paying attention.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for this informative and interesting lecture. And now we would like to open the floor for questions and answers. If you would like to ask a question, kindly stand up and introduce yourself. Please keep your question short to allow others to participate. Yes, please.
Hello, hello. Thank you very much. My name is Taysir Suleiman. Thank you very much, Your Excellencies. Thank you very much for this wonderful lecture. Your Excellency, you have mentioned a number of great ideas to achieve peace, particularly resolving the cause of Palestine. The cause of Palestine and the peace process has been going on for 70 years. My direct question to you, can we have cooperation between Europe on the one hand and the United States to achieve the concepts that you have mentioned in reality, to ensure that we achieve peace and money would be spent on development and helping humanity and human dignity, and instead of spending all this money on weapons and wars and murder and destruction? Thank you very much.
Your question, and yes, you can rely on the European Union to deploy every effort to find peace between Israel and Palestine. We have always supported the two-state solution. The elements of the two-state solution have been known for a very long time. Israel and Palestine have actually gotten quite close to reaching an agreement based on those core elements more than once, but the final step was always missed. So the European position is still to find that two-state solution based on those core elements, to help the parties get there, to work against anything which makes it harder to reach the two-state solutions. And we support, to a large degree, the Palestinian Authority with many peace and confidence building programs. Now, if I can be frank, we used to be quite aligned with the US in our view of the Middle East peace process. Under the current administration, our opinions are diverging a little bit. For example, European Union and its member states do not think it's a good idea to move embassies to West Jerusalem too. We think it's more likely to make a solution more difficult than to make it easier. So to summarize, yes, the European Union is fully in favor of a two-state solution and is deploying many, many efforts to hope that we wind up with two states, one Palestinian, one Israel, living side by side in peace, each with safety and dignity for its people.
Thank you. Any other question, please?
Peace be with you. Your Excellency, the Ambassador, thank you very much for this lecture, and would like to thank the ECSSR and all the officials of ECSSR. Please, briefly, in 3 quick points, with your permission, I would like to pose to them. My first question is the concept of a Holocaust. What do you mean by the Holocaust? This is the first point. The second point, when Brexit, UK left the EU, did this affect the level of economic activity in the EU in general? My third point, as you have kindly mentioned, Germany supported Iraq by 50 billion euros, I'm not sure, maybe 50 billion euros you meant, in support of Iraq, but the reality does not show any fruit of this money. Iraq is still very much facing trouble and issues, major issues. Thank you very much.
Okay, how shall I go about this? I'll be very factual to respond to your first question. By the Holocaust, we understand the systematic persecution and killing of the Jewish people in Europe by Germany under the Nazi rule. I think that's a definition that is historically correct. Brexit. First of all, it hasn't happened. And there's a great confusion about when and how, maybe even if it will happen. That's now in the hands of the British. In Germany, and I think I can say this for the European Union as general, we respect democratic decisions that our British friends take, but we also regret them. Britain is a very valuable partner and friend, and whether Britain is in the EU or outside of the EU, Britain is a European country with a European history and is deeply connected to us economically, historically, culturally, politically, on security policy. And no matter whether they leave or not and how they leave, in the future we will also have a very close and deep connection. But yes, it will affect us. I don't have the exact numbers on the top of my head, but Britain makes up for about 1/6 of the EU economy and round about the same of the EU population. So it is a major, one of our large member states that appears to have embarked on a path to leave the European Union. It will affect us in the long run, I'm sure, because it's a shared mutual interest. We will have a good, healthy, and strong economic relationship between the European Union and Britain. And finally, Iraq, and I mentioned 50 million in stabilization efforts. Yes, sometimes trying to deal with these deeply entrenched conflicts feels like throwing drops of water on a hot stone. But nevertheless, we have to deploy every effort that we can. In the end, a conflict like in Iraq or in any other country can only be resolved by the people within that country. And there has to be the willingness to peace. All we can do is help them materially, help them to meet and talk to each other. Sometimes we say we can arrange the conference room and arrange the drinks, but the conflict parties have to come to the room and make peace. We can't make it for them.
Yes, please.
I am Dr. Al-Mindai Al-Afifi. Thank you very much, sir, for your wonderful lecture. Please allow me to ask you one side question and another important question. I'll be brief as much as I can. First, we see, as you have just said, that as in the quotation, people who don't have past do not have a future. But people are looking at the past. We see the Caesar of Russia and the Persian emperors are trying to relive history. Germany tried to convince France to give up its permanent permanent seat in the Security Council. The NATO has not accepted some security arrangements for this regard. But my question, does Germany want to reach the Fourth Reich? Is Germany looking at its past again, trying to relive the glory of its past? This is the first point. You mentioned Germany and the Strait of Al-Mandab. This region was taken over by a number of militants, and the UN Security Council charged some people to, or some entities to combat those militants. But Germany stopped the flow of weapons to the people fighting the militia. Don't you see the blood spill in Yemen? 50 major German companies are still working in Iran. There is very strong ties between Iran and Germany. Even Trump, when he cancelled the nuclear deal with Iran, still Germany is defending Iran and defending the nuclear deal, which allows Iran to obtain a nuclear weapon. Were you really neutral about the weapons embargo that you have mentioned, or are you following your own interests? Thank you, sir. Shukran.
See, we have some differences of opinion. First of all, let me be very clear, and you might have taken it from my talk about history and so on. Germany has tried to learn from its history. Under totalitarianism and the rule of Nazis, we experienced the deepest, darkest period of our history, of which we are ashamed, and for which we still bear responsibility today. And I tried to explain in my talk that based on that historical experience, we tried to work in partnership, in cooperation, and we do not aspire to rule over others, to control others, to apply force to others, but on the contrary, to be a responsible and cooperative partner to anyone in the world. So we aspire to be exactly the opposite of the Nazis and the opposite of what you call a Fourth Reich. And we're actually having pretty good success at it. So that's something that most Germans feel very strongly about. Then on Yemen, I'll just take the complex of Yemen and export controls and the export of arms. Germany has supported the United Nations Security Council resolution, which said that the conflict in Yemen is an internal struggle between the legitimate government and illegitimate insurgents, and that the coalition is legitimately supporting the legitimate government of Yemen. So we always supported that. But on the arms exports, I have to come back to our history. Germany brought war and destruction to the whole of Europe and tried to bring it to the whole world. And I referred to our founding fathers in 1949. At that time, the goal of the international community was to make sure that Germany never again builds up military force and can pose a threat to its neighbors. And only over the evolution of time, as our neighbors and the international community saw that we're a solid democracy, that we act in a peaceful and responsible way, did we even gain a military again, and did we even start producing arms again. That's why we have an arms export control policy that says we do not export arms into regions where there is fighting. That's, like all the other things I mentioned in my talk, is based on our history. And it's a choice that the Germans have made and that we live with. Mind you, despite having such a restrictive arms export control policy, we're still one of the biggest arms exporters to the world, and we've had very, how do you say, good defense relations with many countries in this region as well. But we do not, as a matter of policy, export arms into areas of conflict. It's part of our special German responsibility.
At the end of today's lecture, and on behalf of His Excellency Professor Jamal Sanad al-Suwaidi, we would like to once again thank His Excellency Ambassador Peter Fischer for his lecture, as well as the member of our audience for their participation. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.